In South Korea, there's a heartbreaking truth that no one really talks about. People in their 60s and older are living through a hidden nightmare. Many can't function normally in society because they're forced to sell their bodies, isolate themselves, or even face the unimaginable, ending their own lives. This isn't just an isolated problem. It's a massive issue affecting the economy and society as a whole. I'm talking about Korea's lost generation, older adults caught in a struggle that's too often ignored. And honestly, most people don't even know it's happening. According to the World Bank, South Korea is aging faster than any other country. Soon, about 20% of the population will be over 65, and that's a huge deal. But here's the kicker. Almost half of these elderly people are living in poverty. They don't have the money, the savings, or even a safety net to help them survive. Even when some get pensions, it's never enough to cover the basics, and they end up depending on their families just to get by. These are the kinds of lives that inspired a movie that really hit home for a lot of people. The Bacchus Lady is a South Korean film about a lonely older woman who has no choice but to resort to selling herself in public parks just to survive. Chon Chan-jun, a member of a local church, said the movie does a pretty accurate job of showing what some elderly folks go through. There's actually a pretty big number of older people in South Korea who are struggling with loneliness, illness, and being cut off from their families. This leaves them with no help at all. Some places, like those run by NGOs, try to step in and support these people. One example is the Universal Solidarity Church, which has been helping over 10,000 elderly people in tough situations over the past 17 years. Even though this kind of activity is illegal in South Korea, it's not unusual to see older women in parks waiting for clients. Just like in the movie, how people feel about these women is all over the place. Some think they're damaging the country's culture, while others see them as victims of a broken system that really needs fixing. A survey in South Korea revealed something heartbreaking. Around 5,000 elderly people in the country take their own lives every year, which is roughly 14 a day. This gives South Korea the highest suicide rate among developed countries and possibly in the world. Another growing issue is dementia. When a husband or wife gets sick and can't take care of their partner anymore, some tragic situations arise. In a heartbreaking case, a husband ended his wife's life and then tried to take his own, but failed. He wasn't given a death sentence, though. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. It's hard to put all the blame on him. The circumstances pushed him to make such a devastating decision. It's honestly shocking that these kinds of tragedies are really happening. Dementia is becoming a bigger issue in South Korea. According to a 2022 report by the Ministry of Health and Welfare, about 1 in 10 South Koreans over 65 has this condition. Back in 1986, there were 935,000 dementia patients aged 65 and older in the country. By 2050, that number is expected to skyrocket to 3.15 million. To tackle this issue, the South Korean government set up dementia care centers across all 25 districts in Seoul. Kim Chi-hoon, who works as the deputy director at one of these centers, shared how they encourage people aged 60 or older to get tested. The process starts with going over the person's medical history and includes interviews to assess the chances of having the disease, followed by more detailed tests. It's not fair to just point fingers at the government or society for this crisis. The problem is super complex, with so many different causes feeding into it. Over time, people age while the economy and society move forward faster and faster. Many elderly folks end up trapped in poverty, thanks to a job market that pushes for early retirement. This leaves them with little savings and no way to maintain a decent quality of life in today's economy or in the future. When it comes to handling an aging society in South Korea, especially with serious health problems like Alzheimer's, it's not just about money. The real challenge is changing attitudes. A lot of people think Alzheimer's is just something that comes with getting older, but in South Korea it's a bit more complicated. Many elderly people don't want to get tested or start treatment because having any kind of mental illness comes with a heavy stigma. Society tends to look down on people who are diagnosed, and as you probably know, social status is a huge deal in South Korea. In fact, in a lot of Asian cultures, what other people think often matters more than your own opinion. That mindset has helped make South Korea one of the most competitive countries in the world. Dealing with an aging population is something many developed countries are struggling with. But in South Korea, the challenges are kind of unique. Here, old age is often tied to loneliness and poverty. If the country's economic and social systems don't change, the idea of growing old with dignity, surrounded by family, staying healthy, and living in peace might stay out of reach for a lot of older people. To understand how South Korea got here, you've got to take a look at the past. Not too long ago, South Korea was mostly an agricultural country. It was super underdeveloped, with a population that didn't have much education, and its economy was in worse shape than North Korea's is today. Fast forward a few decades, and the country transformed into one of the most advanced nations in the world. South Korea has gone through a massive transformation. The country now has better infrastructure than a lot of European nations and cranks out hundreds of thousands of university grads every year. Odds are, you probably have something in your home that was made in Korea. In just one generation, South Korea went from being a third world country to one of the most advanced on the planet. But that progress came with a price. The same things that fueled Korea's economic miracle are now causing issues across the country. South Korea has one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world, and Koreans rank among the least happy people globally. Back in the 1950s, things were pretty bleak. Honestly, the starting point couldn't have been much worse. For most of the early 20th century, Korea was under Japanese rule. This left people without access to education or decent jobs. When World War II ended, the Japanese left, but the country was split. South Korea backed by the US and North Korea backed by the Soviet Union. Not long after, the North invaded the South, sparking a war that wiped out most of the South's industrial infrastructure. By the time the war ended in 1953, South Korea was in rough shape. Most people couldn't read, the economy was centered on farming, and the future looked pretty grim. But that's when the Korean miracle started taking shape. There were three big reasons behind South Korea's crazy economic growth. The first, a bold move by the government in the 1960s to completely overhaul the economy. They didn't go the usual route of supporting small businesses. Instead, they decided to bet big on a few family-run companies, called chaebols. These chaebols got major perks, huge loans, tax breaks, subsidies, you name it. They didn't have to play by the same rules as everyone else, and if they ran into trouble, the government bailed them out. The only catch? They had to deliver the economic growth the country was banking on. On top of that, these companies pushed hard to expand globally, and it worked. These chaebols started cranking out cars, TVs, video games, and just about everything else, turning into massive global corporations. But as they moved into making more advanced products with super complex supply chains, they needed a ton of skilled workers, engineers, managers, accountants, you name it. Basically, they needed people with college degrees. And the Korean government, they were all in for it. That's when the whole education fever really took off. After gaining independence, South Korea's government made education accessible to everyone and pushed the idea hard. If you wanted to succeed in life, you had to go to college. Universities were told to take in as many students as possible, and it worked like a charm. Getting a degree, especially in STEM fields, became the ultimate goal for kids and their parents. In just a few decades, South Korea went from a country where only about 22% of people could read and write in 1945 to being the most educated country in the world. Now, over 23% of young people have a college degree. Once there were enough well-educated people working in these chaebols, the companies made sure to train them up even more. And today, South Koreans are famous for their insane work ethic, clocking in more hours than just about anyone. But here's the thing, it wasn't always like this. The whole extreme work culture we see now was pretty much created during the economic boom. The chaebols started pushing this idea that working for them wasn't just a job, it was a commitment. Employees were told the company came first, above their family, personal life, or even free time. Work became life. Spending crazy long hours in the office, that became the norm. Working late at night, on weekends, and even hanging out with colleagues after hours became a normal part of life. Weirdly enough, this system worked for a while. South Koreans ended up working more hours than almost any other developed country, and this insane dedication played a big role in jump-starting the economic boom. So what's the big secret behind the Korean miracle? It's a mix of these giant companies that dominate the market with government backing, plus a population that's highly educated and immersed in a workaholic culture. Sounds like a perfect recipe for success, right? Well, not quite. The same system that created South Korea's economic miracle has also become its biggest problem. Over time, this extreme work culture has started eating away at the very fabric of society. Take the chaebols, for example. Together, they make up a jaw-dropping 85% of South Korea's GDP. Just Samsung alone accounts for nearly 20% of the entire economy. But here's the kicker. They only provide about 10% of the jobs in the country. Why? Over the years, these companies have gotten ridiculously good at growing without actually hiring more people. As a professor from Seoul National University put it, big companies have mastered the art of surviving without expanding their workforce. It's all about saving money. And while this might have made sense back in the day when there were more jobs than skilled workers, today it's a whole different story. Thanks to that education fever, South Korea is now producing way more college grads than the job market can handle. In fact, the irony is almost cruel. University graduates in South Korea actually have a harder time finding jobs than people who don't have a degree. Let that sink in. It's a bizarre and frustrating situation that you won't see anywhere else in the world. The situation has gotten so bad that the government had to launch a program to help young university graduates find jobs abroad. Why? Because there simply aren't enough jobs in Korea for all of them, and the alternative is staying unemployed and eventually falling into poverty. It's a paradox that shows how poorly the benefits of the economy are distributed. Even though, on a macro level, South Korea's economy might seem to be doing well, the average person isn't really feeling it. And here's another problem. None of these graduates want to take manual labor jobs. In Korean society, blue-collar work is not only low-paying, but also looked down upon. So, on one hand, there's a massive shortage of workers for blue-collar jobs. On the other, you have a huge number of unemployed young people with university degrees who can't use their education. In a society that's so obsessed with success and education, this is obviously even more frustrating. Why do so many young Koreans aim for white-collar jobs? Because they've had to work insanely hard to get their education. The South Korean education system is arguably the most competitive in the world. It's not just about getting into a good university, it's about surviving in an environment where even kids have to work as hard as adults just to keep up. A staggering 83% of 5-year-olds in South Korea attend private after-school classes. Families spend an average of 16% of their income on private education. The government even had to ban private tutoring sessions after 10 p.m. to try to reduce the insane workload Korean kids face. And yet, despite all this, South Korea has experienced massive education inflation. Kids and students are working harder than ever to achieve formal education, but the advantages of that education are disappearing. Even with a degree, many still can't find jobs. Those who do find work often end up in rigid, hierarchical environments where promotions are based more on loyalty to the company than actual performance or results. And while Koreans spend more hours working than almost anyone else in the world, their productivity is surprisingly low. It's a culture that values hard work over smart work, a mindset that's not really working out in the 21st century. The result of this extreme work culture, intense social pressure, and a challenging economic situation is that South Koreans are now among the most unhappy people in the world. South Korea also has the highest suicide rate per capita globally. The problem has been so bad that even the government recognized it 2 decades ago and has tried to make changes. But so far, those efforts haven't had any real impact. Now, the country is stuck with corporations that are too big to fail and too powerful to change. Youth unemployment continues to rise, and the population is increasingly depressed.